Okay, so this is a précis of Freud's essay written, I can't remember quite the year, but the mid 1910s, mid to late 1910s, I think, called A Child is Being Beaten. And this is a crucial text. Um, it's a crucial text to explain why repression occurs. So you can be read alongside some of the metapsychological texts of that era. It's also one of Freud's key essays about masochism. I'll just tilt that up a bit. So, the essay is called "A Child is Being Beaten," and that's where we start. That's the beginning of a description of a fantasy that children have, and we will plot via Freud's essay where this fantasy goes, how it progresses, how it develops, and why it goes down certain paths and then comes back again, particularly in terms of masochism and sadism. So, in the preamble to this essay, Freud says it's crucial to recognise that this fantasy seems to have a certain masturbatory pleasure attached to it. It has this sort of obsessive character and a pleasure that results from that. And he said it starts early in life. So children have fantasies of being punished for crimes or for being naughty. And those fantasies don't seem to have much to do with whether the child has actually been punished or has been beaten as a child. So we have this clear erotic pleasure that results from this beating fantasy, but it's a certain kind of pleasure. It brings with it an intolerable feeling. The punishment that's received clearly cannot be too brutal. And Freud asks, as the first question, is this child that is being beaten, is it the child who is having the fantasy? Or is it another child? Is it sadistic or is it masochistic? And in terms of where this fantasy may go later in life, well, it may be repressed, or it may be sublimated, or it may become fixated and continue into adulthood in some version or other. But Freud does suggest that children who have this fantasy have a well-developed sadistic bent. Questionable where this might come from, but there is a well-developed sadistic, almost instinct. And in adulthood, this sadism becomes repressed. And the result of that repression in adulthood can be some of the classic signs we see in obsessional neurosis. Okay, so let's trace how this childhood fantasy progresses. So the first phase of the fantasy is where the child being beaten is another child. It's not me, it's another child. And the one doing the beating is an adult. In fact, we can be more specific. The person doing the beating, the adult, is in fact the fantasizer's father. So if I've got the fantasy, if I'm the one doing the fantasizing, it's my father who is beating another child. We'll come back to this a bit later. Well, in fact, we'll kind of move around it as we go through. But Freud is very clear that the child having this fantasy is always a girl. There is a different version of events when the child is a boy, and we will come to that towards the end. So I, the female child, have a fantasy that my father is beating another child, and that other child is a child who I hate, and I hate him or hate her because he or she is a rival, a love rival. So that's the first phase. We can see that as having, as I say, quite a sadistic twist to it. In the second phase, the child being beaten is now me. It's the holder of the fantasy. I am being beaten by my father. And there is now, Freud says, a highly pleasurable feeling attached to the fantasy. And this is the phase of the fantasy, Freud says, that is both the most important because it carries this intense, pleasurable libidinal charge and a sense of guilt. And it's also the phase that never becomes conscious. It's never consciously felt. And clearly, having had the sadistic bent in the first phase, we've now moved into a masochistic angle. I am being beaten by my father. And in the third phase of the fantasy, we have a kind of regression to the first phase. But now I'm looking on, seeing several children, and Freud says that these several children, if the fantasizer is a girl, will all be boys. I'm looking on, seeing several children being beaten. And for the first time, this is the first time where the fantasy has a kind of conscious masturbatory character. Operative in this third phase, you can see two substitutes. Other children, a group of other children, have been substituted for me, and a father figure, some kind of other adult, is now the substitute or the stand-in for the father. So, just to recap those three phases. My father is beating the child who I hate. That's phase one. It has a sadistic character, and it is a conscious fantasy. Phase two, I am being beaten by my father. And this is has a masochistic character, and is unconscious. And then the third phase, I am looking on, seeing several children being beaten by an adult. So once again, we've moved back to a sadistic and a conscious phase of the fantasy. What can we say about all of this? So other children clearly are hated because they are rivals for love. The child beats the other child, but he doesn't beat me because he loves me. That's the meaning of the first phase. And it's not sexual and it's not sadistic, but perhaps we can see the roots of both in that first phase of the fantasy. And then during the genital stage, the Oedipal stage, the child will have a desire to beget a child. These are Freud's words, to beget a child. So the boy has the fantasy of having a child with the mother, and the girl has a fantasy of having a child with the father. And these incestuous desires must be repressed. And it's curious that Freud is rather fatalistic, really, about why these incestuous desires wither on the vine. Just like in the Sophocles myth, fate, the hand of fate seems to play the deciding part. But these desires live on in the unconscious, and for this reason perhaps they're accompanied by powerful feelings of guilt. And it's guilt that switches things from the first phase to the second. So the first switch we see, I become the object of the beating. So guilt is the thing that turns sadism into masochism. But that switch is also a symptom of the repression that's happened. So in the first phase, my father loves me, but gradually I realise the genital nature of that desire, and that's what must be repressed. So my father loves me becomes substituted with my father beats me. Punishment here is a substitute for love. And of course that punishment is highly erotic because the love from which it stems, that incestuous love, is a very erotic love. And incidentally, Freud suggests that while the beating fantasy is almost always repressed by girls, boys may not repress a fantasy of being beaten by their mothers, but may simply transfer that fantasy onto other children's mothers or other suitable women, those auntie figures that are omnipresent in childhood. They were in my childhood anyway. And then the third phase seems like a repetition of the first. I watch a scene where my father or some kind of authority substitute punishes another child or a group of children. And Freud says that this phase has a sadistic form, but its content, the satisfaction that's gained from it, is masochistic. Because after all, those children that I'm watching being beaten are simply substitutes for myself. So the perversion arises during the Oedipus complex, and it persists after the complex has been dissolved, and it carries with it the libidinal charge and the guilt attached to it. Now in this essay, Freud states, as he also does a little earlier in Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, that masochism is a secondary derivative of sadism. A bit later on in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he will make a claim for primary masochism. But for now he is saying that masochism is secondary. It's secondary to sadism. And the turnaround from sadism to masochism, which we see here in the second phase of the beating fantasy, it happens because of the guilt which occurs during the repression of incestuous desire, the repression that happens in the Oedipus during the Oedipus complex. And just a final note on that that most important but unconscious phase. Freud says that there is a group of people who are especially sensitive to father figures and who in some way bring about a realization of being beaten by their father. And he wonders, rather intriguingly, whether the roots of paranoia lie here. So, finally, I said at the beginning that Freud believed that the fantasizer that we've been talking about is always a girl. So he asks at the end of the essay, so what about boys? Well, first he says it appears that boys fantasize about being beaten by the mother. But actually he says that is secondary to the fantasy that we've seen before with girls, the fantasy of I am being beaten by my father. The second phase, and it's crucial in fact that this is the origins of the boys' version of the fantasy, is the second phase of the girl's fantasy, the masochistic unconscious phase that says I am being beaten by my father. Now here again, punishment is analogous to being loved, but the sequence for boys is a little different. The movement here goes, we begin, I am loved by my father. We then see I am being beaten by my father, and then I am being beaten by my mother. So here the boy is passive from the start. Unlike the girl, there is no switch from sadism to masochism and then back again. There is no original sadism here. The fantasy remains masochistic throughout. But what's interesting is that unlike the girl, for the boy, the sex of the beater, the adult doing the beating, changes from male to female. And of course, in both of these versions, the origin is I am loved by my father and I love my father. Both of the fantasies begin with an incestuous love for the father. So it seems that what's happening here is that the boy represses a homosexual desire, an incestuous love for his father, by assuming a feminine disposition. That is, he remains a boy, but he feels like a girl, and his object is now a woman, but with the characteristics, the aggressive, beating characteristics of a man. Whereas for the girl, she represses her incestuous desire by assuming a male disposition, in other words, assuming a sadistic, active disposition. But even in doing that, even in assuming that male disposition, in becoming a boy, she cannot escape the punishment of her father.